Welcome to It's Your Dime, a straight talk interview series presented by SchiffGold. I'm your host, Mike Maharrey. In this episode, I'll be talking to Jeff Deist, president of the Mises Institute. Jeff and I will talk about the Austrian School of Economics and what it brings to the table, the biggest threat to our freedom, the problem with the Federal Reserve, Richard Nixon closing the gold window, Trumponomics, and the crisis in Turkey. Well, thank you so much for watching It's Your Dime. Today we have Jeff Deist, the president of the Mises Institute, with us. Hey, Jeff, how you doing?
Hey, good morning, Mike. I'm doing great.
Good. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us. And we're going to delve a little bit into some Austrian economics, which I'm not sure that everybody that's watching this will be familiar with. So maybe it'll be a good learning exercise. What I would like for you to do first off is just kind of give the elevator pitch. What in the world is this Mises Institute, and why is it necessary?
Well, it's a good question. I noticed that here we are in 2018 and we're still talking about and debating socialism. Somehow it keeps cropping up no matter how much we refute it, either in the historical record or in theoretical work. So unfortunately, I think every libertarian, every liberty-minded person, every libertarian organization, their number one job, their number one goal is to refute the gross economic errors of our age and really every age, because like I said, they keep cropping up. So this is really our goal, is to provide real economics for a lay audience. Now, we certainly do a lot of work with scholars and with PhDs. We try to help young people along in their careers if they want to become economists or professors. But our primary audience is lay people, because as I'm sure you know, a lot of people get through high school and even college never taking a single economics course. And so by coming to the Mises Institute, just consuming a little bit of our material, they can very quickly, unfortunately, in a sense, know more than 99% of the people out there walking around about economics. And it's, you know, these mythologies are durable. We keep hearing the same things about trade protectionism, about entitlements, about welfare, about markets, about taxes, about regulations, and all of these things have been debunked. And we know that we're correct on economics, but we haven't sold proper economics, what I would consider proper economics, correctly. Even given all the advantages we have all these great thinkers like Mises and Rothbard and Hayek who've gone before us and really laid it out. We don't have to do the hard intellectual work. Most of us are not equipped to be a real originator in economics or libertarian philosophy. We simply have to take this great material that already exists and go out there and build on it and promote it better. So that's really what the Mises Institute is all about. We want to be an alt school, an alternative school for people that they can come to as much or as little as they like at any time in their life, and come consume some economics education, because you're not going to get it in high school and you're not going to get it in the vast majority of colleges today.
Well, I'll give you a little plug because I think the Mises Institute has been extremely fundamental, excuse me, fundamental in my own political and economic development. I actually came from the kind of conservative, the standard Republican edge of the world, and got introduced to Tom Woods through the 10th Amendment Center when I started working with them. And he pointed me to a lot of the resources that you guys have. And the resources are amazing. I just encourage everybody to check out Mises.org. I mean, free books, articles, everything that you could ever want is right there at your fingertips. It's an amazing organization. So your actually background as a tax attorney. How in the world did you end up the president of an institute that focuses on liberty and economics?
Well, I was a lawyer for many years, about 2 decades. But during that period, you know, early on when I was still an undergraduate, actually, I'd had an opportunity to meet Ron Paul when he ran for president in 1988. I was an undergraduate student. In the early 1990s, I went to law school and spent a little bit of time in the California Libertarian Party. And through all of these things, kept in touch with Ron Paul a little bit, and then ultimately worked for him for a short while in his Washington, D.C. office. Through Ron Paul, I got to know Lou Rockwell, and ultimately came to the Mises Institute years later. But I certainly never planned on it. I thought I was going to be a lawyer throughout my career. And the reason I chose tax, other than at the time it was perhaps one of the a reasonably lucrative area of law, but also the idea that my client would always be the good guy. There's no such thing as a just tax. There's no such thing as cheating on your taxes. And so in most areas of legal practice and litigation or in criminal law or whatever it might be, neither side is really squeaky clean. But when it comes to taxes, nobody owes those. And so there, the fact that some guy didn't disclose all of his taxes on his return, I always thought was a fine and noble thing. So I enjoyed trying to help people pay less.
I think people that are familiar with Peter Schiff's dad's story will definitely appreciate your view on taxes. Um, so when people look at stuff at the Mises Institute, this term Austrian economics is going to come up,
Mhm.
and for a long time I didn't have any earthly idea what that meant. I thought, oh, that's it's a different thing. Can you kind of give a quick overview of what is different about Austrian economics than say what you're going to learn in your micro and macro class in college? What is Austrian economics kind of fundamentally, and what does it bring to the table that some of the other approaches don't?
Well, first and foremost, it's a broad term. It's a term of convenience to describe two or three key economists who happen to be from Austria: Karl Menger, Eugene von Baerwerk, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, who happen to be Austrians, and then certain fans of theirs that developed across the West. So it's a loose term of convenience. It's not a dogmatic or school or a monolithic school of thought. But basically, Austrian economics really differs from the mainstream economics profession today in one key point, which is that it properly views economics as a social science. Economics isn't math. It isn't physics. We can't use syllogisms. We can't apply the same scientific methods. Human beings aren't atoms or particles or numbers. Human beings are rational and irrational people who get up every day and do all kinds of predictable and not so predictable things. So as a result, we have to approach economics in a very different way than we approach the hard sciences. But at some point during the 20th century, the profession of economics was captured. It was captured by econometricians, people who want to apply mathematical and statistical approaches to human action. And of course, when Keynes came along in the 1930s, and then sort of neo-Keynesian or post-Keynesian thinkers after him, they also took economics down this path where the goal of public policy, whether that's fiscal or monetary, is always to increase demand. We constantly need to provoke people to buy more stuff. Consumption is the key to the economy. And from the Austrian perspective, that's the opposite. Saving money, spending less than you consume, and thereby accumulating capital is what allows society to get richer and more productive. So it's the productive side of the economy, not the consumption side of the economy, on which we ought to focus. So it's really a wholly different way of looking at econ as a social science. And as a result of that, there's philosophical and psychological elements to it. It's actually a lot more zesty and a lot more fun for people who aren't professional economists or PhDs and don't want to be intellectuals, but just want to understand how the world works. And that's really what it's all about. It's understanding how the world works and how the economy works, as opposed to trying to pin human action into statistical or mathematical models.
It's interesting that you say fun because I have an accounting degree in my previous life, and so I took several economics classes when I was in college the first time around. I took micro, macro. I think I took labor econ. Oh my gosh, I just absolutely hated it. It was boring. I didn't get all of the equations. I didn't want to memorize all that stuff. And I remember when I started getting politically involved, and I thought I need to understand economics better, but I just absolutely dreaded it. And some people pointed me to some stuff by like Murray Rothbard and Economics in One Lesson, like by Henry Hazlitt. And I'm reading these things like, oh, this is interesting. I get this. I can wrap my head around it. It's not this, like you say, I don't have to be some kind of a PhD physicist to understand what's going on. And I think people that are bored by the very thought of economics, again, I would really encourage you to check out the resources over at Mises.org, because there are so many things to read. And I think you'll find that it's really interesting because it gets into human action and how we behave and how those things impact the various systems and markets and things like that. So I will agree with you that that approach is much more fun and enjoyable, and quite frankly, more easy to understand.
Yeah,
Um,
there's no question.
yeah. So I'm gonna pivot a little bit, and it's not just about economics. We really talk a lot about liberty and freedom. In your view, this is a big, broad question, so you can kind of narrow it down, take this down whatever path you want to. But what right now do you think is the biggest threat to freedom?
The biggest threat to freedom is bad ideas. The bad ideas that unfortunately probably a majority of Americans cling to. I think the idea that the state is legitimate, that the state is moral, that it acts on our behalf as our agent because we voted for it. Um, the idea that it can do things legally that individuals or groups cannot. And maybe most importantly, yet, the idea that the state, along with its central bank, can make us all wealthier by creating debt and more money, not more goods and services, more money. These are all dangerously bad ideas that have a lot to do with the what plagues America and the West today. But I think we ought to, as libertarians, be a little more focused. I think we ought to worry about the Federal Reserve. I think we ought to worry about the dollar and debt and entitlements. And I think we ought to worry about the deranged war policy that drives both major parties in this country. And it yields so much, not only death and destruction, but also almost unbelievable amounts of debt, now over $20 trillion. And big chunks of that were created by wandering into Iraq and Afghanistan. So liberty-minded people tend to accept and swallow a lot of the premises that progressives use to frame the debate. And I think we ought not to do that. I think our default position should be that we don't allow ourselves to be brought into the question, well, what should government do about X? But rather, we ought to be framing the debates to say government harms X, government should do nothing about Y. So, as far as I'm concerned, liberty minded people ought to talk about the Fed, they ought to talk about war and peace, and they ought to talk about state power. And by state power, I mean civil liberties, spying, drug war, etc. We tend to dilute the message by wandering off into sideline issues when those are really the core, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's something that kind of occurred to me when you were talking, because I think, your mainstream left and your mainstream right both have certain problems with government. Like they don't wholesale reject the notion as we might, but they have certain problems with it. On the right, they have a problem with the runaway social spending, and on the left, at least traditionally, they have been more anti-war. Uh, it's hard to say that anymore the way things have evolved. But if you kind of go to your hard left is still, I think, pretty anti-war. And yet none of them ever really focus in on the central bank and the Federal Reserve. And in my view, that's the institution that makes all of it possible. The money printing and the debt. We wouldn't have all of these wars and all of this spending if we didn't have a central bank that was effectively creating money out of thin air. And that kind of leads me to the next question. You kind of touched on it, but I want to talk a little bit more about the Fed. And I think that's something that this audience is particularly interested in as investors, and people are interested in what's going on in the economy. Um, why do you think the Federal Reserve is such a problem? I mean, what is it doing that is so damaging to our economy?
Well, it is the enabler. It is the enabler of Congress. Congress is the addict. Congress is addicted to spending more than it brings in tax revenue, year after year after year, both nominally and off and generally in real terms, but certainly always nominally. The U.S. federal budget grows year after year after year. You can't say that Reagan or anybody else shrunk the government. The government's getting bigger. Okay, this is just simple mathematical fact, and the Federal Reserve makes it possible in a very complex way. And it involves a lot of facets. And it's not always easy to explain to people in a soundbite. The fact that the US dollar is the world's reserve currency coming out of the post Bretton Woods era, the fact that we are the military superpower of the world, the fact that our dollar is in some ways the least dirty shirt in the laundry because of the way other central banks conduct their own affairs. All of these things come together to make it so that there's still lots and lots of demand for dollars. As a result of this, uh, Congress and the Treasury can work together and produce a lot of Treasury debt, and people still buy it. Increasingly, the Fed buys and owns quite a bit of it, but nonetheless, there is still a market, even at low interest rates, for U.S. Treasury debt. So for the moment, everything seems a-okay, and Congress just continues to spend beyond its means. But imagine if we didn't have this magic debt machine available to us. Imagine if W in the early 2000s, Mike, had to come out and say, as Americans, we all agree that we got to take out Saddam Hussein and we have to make the Middle East safe for democracy. And we got to save the Iraqis. And we have to go into Afghanistan as well and solve intractable medieval problems in that country. Okay, fine. We all agree, right? But we don't believe in debt. So every household in America is going to be issued, depending on its size, a $250 to $1,000 surcharge every month, payable to Uncle Sam, to pay for this war, because we believe in paying as we go and we don't believe in incurring debt. And we all believe that these wars are just and required and necessary. We got to fight them over there, so we're not fighting them over here. Imagine how Americans would have balked at the idea of having to pay even a few $100 a month to actually prosecute these unholy wars without incurring more debt. Well, it would have been an absolute non-starter. But as a result of the federal government and the Fed's ability to obscure the cost and the long-term impact of all of this war spending and entitlement spending, they get away with it. And that's why it's so critical that people understand the Fed and what it means.
Absolutely. And I'll emphasize something that you said about the government spending growing on a pretty consistent basis. I actually did a project for the 10th Amendment Center recently and went back to 1940, because that's the numbers I could find, and tracked government spending through each administration. And every single administration, and this is inflation adjusted to 2009 dollars, every single administration spent more than the previous one. So Reagan spent more than Carter, Bush 1 spent more than Bush 2, Clinton spent more than Bush, Obama spent more than W, and Trump is on pace to spend more than Obama. So this idea that whether you have a Republican or a Democrat sitting in the White House or controlling Congress really doesn't matter. There is a continual upward trajectory. And it's the same if you say spending by GDP, it's there are some peaks and valleys in that, but still the progression is upward. So you're absolutely right about the government continuing to grow. Let's kind of touch on something that's well, it's not really in the news. It's a historical event. Yesterday was the 47th anniversary of Richard Nixon, quote unquote, closing the gold window. Uh, so, how significant do you think that was, and maybe kind of link the untethering of our money from anything that has any real tangible existence? How has that enabled the Federal Reserve to kind of push things forward on this upward trajectory?
Well, it's been absolutely devastating, and there's been a tremendous loss of purchasing power in the dollar and the value of the dollar as a savings tool since the Bretton Woods Agreement was done away with. And we have to go back all the way to the 1930s to find the last time where a U.S. citizen could actually redeem a paper dollars for real gold. And then from the 30s up until the early 1970s, only foreign governments could do so. And then Nixon put an end to that. So what that really means is what was originally designed to be a certificate, a piece of paper that said this is redeemable in gold, became the currency itself, completely, fully, and without any recourse to any kind of limits, I should say. So it really was a time when the world turned. And Nixon famously, I don't know that he actually said this, but he's alleged to have said, we're all Keynesians now. And what that means is that we are going to use government policy to stimulate demand. And one way we do that is by creating more dollars when we deem necessary. And we've seen since then, since 1971, the Federal Reserve has gone into hyperdrive. And the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has grown enormously. And of course, just since the crash of 2008, it has more than quadrupled. So we've got literally trillions of dollars of base money in US dollars out there that didn't exist before. And what we don't know, because there's no historical precedent, is what happens if and when the world's reserve currency goes kaput. We've never seen this. We've had plenty of instances where a national or regional currency caused a lot of pain in places like Weimar Germany, in Thailand in the 90s, of course, in Argentina in the late 90s. So we've seen what a currency crisis looks like, but we've never seen it on a global scale. So it's very, very scary that the organization charged with controlling the dollar, the US Federal Reserve Bank, is so unhinged and just doing whatever it can to stimulate things and to keep demand up and especially to prop up equities markets. It's very, very frightening to me because we simply don't know where it might lead.
So we've been doing this pretty pretty much pedal to the metal since the 2008 crisis. And right now, if you turn on your mainstream economic news, everybody is all giddy. I mean, everything's great. We've got, unemployment's low, stock market's high, everything's wonderful. As far as the eye can see, we had what, 4.1 GDP in the second quarter. So everybody's all excited about it. And a lot of people are giving credit to the Donald Trump policies, primarily the tax cuts and the trade war and the new trade policy. So we're making America great in trade. And I'm all for tax cuts. I don't want anybody to think Mike Maharrey hates tax cuts. No, I like tax cuts. But Peter Schiff has said something that I think is pretty significant. We don't really need tax relief. We need government relief. So I wonder what your take on Trumponomics is. I mean, has Trump really fixed the economy, or is he just blowing more air into the bubble?
No, he hasn't fixed it. And of course, by taking credit for what appears on paper to be a healthy economy at the moment sets him up to also be blamed for a lot of things that are already set in motion well before he was ever president that might bite him during his own 4 or 8 years in office. So it's very dangerous rhetoric coming from him. These tax cuts are so minor and so complex that at this point they're really just a form of political pandering. They're a political tool to try to win favor from this group or that group. There's no sort of real meaningful across the board serious reduction in people's tax burdens. Of course, a minor reduction is good. I don't want to poo-pah that. But as far as tariffs, look, the case against tariffs has been made so many times so well by people way smarter than me that you scarcely want to even argue about it anymore. Tariffs are taxes. They create this fetish for exports over imports, and they attempt to prop up the manufacturing and exporting class over the consumer and importing class. And none of it makes any sense. It's all been demolished, both in theory and practice. But here's the thing. Uh, Trump ran as a protectionist. There are YouTubes of Trump in the 80s talking about protectionism, which is a little odd if you think about it. He's a property developer. You think he'd want cheap imported steel or rebar or whatever it might be. But nonetheless, he ran as a protectionist and people voted for him as a protectionist. And that's not only because there's economic ignorance, it's because there are winners and losers. There are people who benefit from protective tariffs, namely domestic industries, certain companies. So when we as libertarians, we're sometimes facile. We say, oh my gosh, how could anyone not understand tariffs? Well, maybe they do understand tariff just fine, but they want to benefit from restrictions or higher prices on imports. This is just human nature. So Trump's not an idiot in this sense. It's just something he believes in, and a lot of his constituency agrees. And what's so interesting about all this is, of course, it puts labor unions in a bind. Because labor unions believe in tariffs on imported goods, but they also believe in voting Democrat. And Donald Trump is basically a Democrat, but he had that big flashing R by his name. So, we live in interesting times, but I think libertarians need to get over the idea that, oh my gosh, we've already smashed these arguments. We haven't smashed the argument against self-interest. And that's what really drives a lot of the support for tariffs, not economics.
That's a really good point. And I say this all the time when people ask me about tariffs. I said the first thing you need to do whenever you hear the word tariff, substitute the word tax, because that's exactly what it is. And that changes the equation a little bit, because I think some people don't get that. They hear tariff and it's some other thing. And I think if people wrap their head around the fact that they are being taxed, it ultimately means you're going to pay more for some things than you were. I think maybe people would be a little bit less inclined to support it. But you're right; it's like anything in politics, there are winners and losers, and it probably is a pretty shrewd political strategy. I think you're right. Peter Schiff has been hammering on this idea that Trump is setting himself up for a fall guy. He's been hammering on that for about a year. So uh, definitely agree with that. Let's kind of turn for just a second to some stuff that's going on overseas. Probably most people are aware that there is an unfolding economic crisis. Some have said, you have used that term, in Turkey, and there's some fear that that could spread outside of the borders of Turkey. There was a really good article on the Mises Wire by economist Daniel. Is it LaSalle? Is that how you pronounce his
He
name?
pronounced it Lakaye.
Lakaye. Well, I butchered that, didn't I? But a fantastic article about the problems in Turkey, and he said that they could actually end up creating a bigger problem than Greece. But the thing that I found interesting was about it was that there seemed to be some parallels between what has led up to this crisis in Greece and what we've seen our central bank here in the United States do. What are your kind of your take on what's going on over there in Turkey?
Well, it is amazing, and as Daniel pointed out, the Turks have increased their money supply 3 or 4 times. I think 3 or 4 times over in less than a decade. So that's pretty amazing. And let's not forget, it wasn't that long ago, just maybe 10 years ago, right after the crash, everyone was touting the economic success of Turkey. They were pointing to this supposed 8% or 10% annual GDP growth, saying, oh my gosh, Turkey needs to join the European Union, which would actually have made it the second biggest country behind Germany in Europe. And so basically, Turkey was being touted as this miraculous example of a modern secular Middle Eastern country, and everyone thought that Erdogan was going to be the next Ataturk in that he would allow a degree of religious freedom, not for other religions. Turkey is something like 99% Muslim, but for moderate forms of Muslim Islam to flourish. Of course, we've seen Erdogan go in a very different direction since that. We've seen a few terrorist incidents and some other things, apart from just this currency crisis that has caused tourism to fall off in Turkey. And then we have this unholy mother of debt, whereby Turkey has a lot of debt, but it's denominated in other currencies. So the idea that they are a sovereign issuer of their own Turkish lira, and if they need to, they can create money to pay off debts, doesn't apply when those debts are denominated in euro or dollar or won or yen or whatever they might be. So it's a very tough situation, and it mirrors that of Greece a few years back, because here we have Greece independently issuing its own debt, but yet it uses the euro as a currency. So there's some interesting parallels there. And what I fear all this is going to lead to, Mike, is that we're going to have some more of these crises, as we saw in Greece, as we might see in Italy, as we're seeing in Turkey, and that this is going to cause some demand for a global organization like the IMF to come along and say, oh, it's too dangerous to allow all these countries to have their own sovereign currencies and then to be borrowing in all these other currencies and issuing bond debt. So, it's too messy. We need a global currency. That is something that interests me, but it also frightens me quite a bit. I think Turkey is in big trouble. I think they ought to listen to Professor Steve Hanke, who's at Loyola in Baltimore, and create a currency board, which Hungary did, and immediately created some stability around their currency. And I think most of all, they need to take their foot off the gas and accept a recession and stop printing money. I mean, that's the bottom line. You can't print money and expect your currency not to fall in value precipitously. Bottom line.
Right, and that's exactly what we're doing here in the United States. And of course, the dollar's strong right now, and there's various reasons for that. But at some point, you have to pay the piper, as the saying goes. Speaking of currency, and we'll kind of wrap up with this thought. I mean, we talk a lot about the problems, and we see the manipulation that the government and the central banks are imposing upon our economy. But as individuals, we can take action ourselves. And one of the things that I'm interested in, and I think is important, is the idea of alternate currency or currency competition. I mean, there's nothing that says we have to use dollars. There are a lot of options now with electronic transfer. You can buy things. You can buy a cup of coffee in gold over at Gold Money. We've got various different types of crypto that are developing. Do you see this kind of evolution of currency competition maybe at some point undermining this Federal Reserve monopoly on money?
Boy, I hope so. I hope so. That was Hayek's dream, denationalizing money. And there's a book out there called The Bitcoin Standard by a friend of ours named Saifuddin Ammous in Lebanon. And he has a blurb on the back from Nassim Taleb. And he says, look, even if Bitcoin doesn't work, we've shown it can be done. So there'll be another Bitcoin out there. So just by virtue of the fact that cryptos can be created from a technological perspective and can work in that sense, that alone will be a bit of a cautionary drag on central banks. So I thought that was really interesting to contemplate, and I hope that's true. The big problem for Americans anyway is that we're required to pay taxes in U.S. dollars, and also that when we buy things with other kinds of assets like crypto or gold, the US IRS says, well, that's a taxable exchange of one asset for another. That's not just buying something with currency, that's an asset and you have to have a capital gain or loss on that. So that creates a big headache, if not an actual tax bill for people who want to use, for example, cryptos or gold money. You have to track every transaction, and that becomes quite a pain if you're buying a sandwich at Starbucks or whatever. So there's a lot of institutional pressure on people to use dollars, and by comparison, when it comes to currencies, the U.S. dollar is an excellent medium of exchange around the world. So there's a self interest among Americans in using dollars. It's a great currency by comparison only. It's a great currency in that sense. So it's very, very tough. It's very, very tough for other competitors to emerge to government money. And this is something Ron Paul tried to press during his years in Congress. Look, let's just legally allow competition in currency so that people can sort of choose for themselves. And the Fed and the dollar can keep doing what it does, but allow people to transact using gold or silver or crypto or whatever it might be without coming along trying to put them in a cage for doing so. It's a fascinating idea. Unfortunately, I think human nature being what it is, it might take a crash before people really see the need for and the benefit from private forms of currency that are outside of government control. Because all these governments in the West and even in the East are profligate. None of them really has their fiscal house in order. None of them really have a handle on the future. So, when the crash comes, let's hope that Bitcoin or some other crypto or even some other new technology is there in place so that we have a fallback, at least some way, that doesn't force us to either accept uh, a scary currency devaluation in our own national currency, or God forbid, even worse, going back to barter. And we can joke, but these are not unforeseeable things necessarily. So let's hope that technology works its way around the state and we really do have denationalized currencies as Hayek wanted.
Absolutely. And I'll emphasize this. One of the things that you can do uh, to protect yourself from currency devaluation is to hold precious metal, gold or silver. And you don't want to try to do that after the crash happens. Now is the time to be prepared for these kind of things, to diversify your portfolio. And folks can talk to the precious metal specialist over at SchiffGold to learn more about that. I want to kind of dovetail off of something else that you said real quick too. There's some interesting things going on at the state level in terms of trying to foster some currency competition, at least within the borders of a state. For instance, Utah and a couple of other states have actually declared gold and silver, other precious metals, as legal tender, and you can actually pay bills in those states using gold or silver. And then we've seen a pretty strong movement over the last couple of years of states, at least, uh, getting rid of sales tax on gold and silver, and doing some other things like that. Wyoming passed some very interesting bills this past year to try to stimulate the environment for cryptocurrency. So there are some things going on at the state level. And I know you and I both share a passion for decentralization. So it is at least exciting to see some states getting on board and trying to create a better environment where at least maybe there's a chance for some of these alternatives to take root.
Yeah, it's amazing. Of course, Texas has created its gold depository. which I think is a very interesting development. But what it really says is that there are actually some people out there in legislatures across America who are worried about what's going on with the Fed and want to have some kind of backup way to protect their own citizens in case things are going the way you and I probably think they're going. So I really applaud that, and it's heartening to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jeff, I'll let you go. I know you've got some other things you've got to get to today. I really appreciate you taking a little bit of time to talk. Before we go, why don't you let people know where to find you? I don't know if you do Twitter, and definitely the Mises Institute website, and anything else that you want to plug real quick.
Well, I'm a middling Twitterer. I'm not a lazy Twitterer. I'm not a super active Twitterer. It's just at Jeff Deist, all one word, Deist. You have to follow at Mises. You absolutely need to be following that Twitter feed, which is absolutely an active one. And of course, just come to Mises.org and you will have a lifetime's worth of reading if you care to have it.
Absolutely. I will second that. I've downloaded a number of books that that are still on my shelf to read. So or at least my virtual shelf. So again, thanks a lot, Jeff Deist from the Mises Institute. We appreciate you being on the show, and all the best to you.
Thanks, Mike.
You've been watching It's Your Dime, an interview series presented by SchiffGold. For more information on investing in gold and silver, talk to a SchiffGold precious metal specialist today at 1-888-GOLD-160. That's 1-888-465-3160. Or visit us on the web at SchiffGold.com. You can keep up with all of the latest precious metals news at SchiffGold.com/news. And tune in each week to the SchiffGold Friday Gold Wrap podcast. This is your host, Mike Maharrey. I appreciate you watching, and I'll talk to you again next time.